Perfect. Our three speakers will do a presentation each, and this will be followed by a question and answer section. But feel free to use our Q&A section on the right of the screen throughout the webinar, and we'll keep an eye on it. And alternatively, feel free to use the hands up function once you're finished the presentations and are moving into the discussion section. So we are thrilled to be joined by three fantastic speakers: our own CEO, Sue Shaw, Paddy Connolly, the CEO with Age Action, and Damien Peelo, CEO from Treoir. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We'd also like to thank the Community Foundation Ireland for their ongoing support of our work on tackling ageism. The topic of ageism is both incredibly important and all too often overlooked. Feelings of othering, isolation, and diminished agency are experienced by many people as they age in society. These issues result both from structural problems, such as the ability to continue to live in the home, issues of financial security, and also from language, paternalistic approaches to healthcare, exclusion from policy making, and language in the media, to name but a few. Indeed, just today, a number of media outlets, while reporting on the experiences of older people during COVID-19, have referred to this diverse demographic as elderly, a term which does not resonate with many people as they grow older, and which portrays older people as passive and inactive, which, as many people who are in this webinar today know, could not be further from the truth. So without further ado, I'd like to get stuck in, and I call on Sue Shaw to get things going. So Sue, I'm going to spotlight you there, so come on in.
Hi folks, it's great to see you all here, and we appreciate that you have given us your time today on what we, as Una has said, believe is a really important topic. There's no doubt that there are more older people in the world now than at any other time in history, and we are only in the middle of this trend. What is disappointing is that research has shown that ageism, in the form of pervasive negative attitudes towards older people, is accepted as the norm in many, many cultures. Often, many ageist attitudes are subtle, overlooked, more often than not can be perceived or received as a compliment. I can remember on many occasions being out with my mother and her four sisters when they were about 70, in their 70s. And often staff would approach them and say things to them like, "Oh, good evening, young ladies. How can I help you?" Let me tell you, the subtle implication of that was that being younger was better. That was a compliment to these women. I think that can be understood in the context of a business industry that is built solely on anti-aging products, for both men and for women. That in itself highlights for us the negativity attached to aging. We sometimes, in the sense of overlooking it, forget as we walk in and out of our chemists every day or our supermarkets, our products aimed at keeping us young, because that is better. I also need to add that one of my aunts, who was slightly more vocal, tackled one of the people who said it to her and said, "A modicum of respect is what I would like to be served with today, please," which I thought was a really good answer. Language is such a powerful tool. And if we think of the great orators throughout history, they have used words as a mechanism to inspire us, to motivate us, help us see their vision and encourage us to follow them. However, we are also aware from our members that language can be used in a really negative context. Many of our members talk to us about family members or themselves who have been talked down to, as though they were a child or they didn't understand. They were spoke to in the context of their age rather than any direct engagement. We have many stories about this, but one that strikes a particular chord with me is a friend of mine. Her mum broke her arm and was in hospital, and she was visiting her. And as she approached the ward, she could hear the nurse coaxing her mum into eating. And she was saying to her, "Come come on, eat all your dinner, and if you're really good and we'll give you some lovely ice cream. Her mum refused, said absolutely nothing because she felt really vulnerable. But afterwards spoke to her daughter, and her comments were, you know what, as a child, I hated being spoken down to. You know, it got no better. I thought I'd never grow up. And here I am, all grown up, and they're doing it still. That to us tells us a huge amount about how we view older people. Sorry. I think that incident or that piece appealed to me or struck the chord with me because it hit ageism across the spectrum. We no more have a right to talk down to a child than we have to talk to an adult in that context. I think often we think sometimes of ageism just as older people. I think that captures it. It can go across the age, the life cycle. Advertising campaigns are built around words as well as images. And we only have to hear a word often to make the association with it. We sometimes lose sight of that. So just to illustrate what I mean, I'd like to do a very small demonstration, for the want of a better word. So I'm asking you to bear with me on this. I'm going to name some words. What I'd like you to do is just see the image that comes into your mind. Okay, so if we're good to go, Coca-Cola, Red Bull, Comfort, BMW, Chanel number 5. So I can see those images in my mind, and I'm hoping you can as well. So for me, they are words. They are brand names. Our mind automatically made that association. That image emerged very, very easily for us. The impact of language cannot, how they create those images in our mind cannot be understated. As we go through life, from cradle to grave, if we are hearing negative imagery around older people, and we internalize it, it automatically creates within us a fear of aging. This was brought home to me recently. I was in conversation with a young woman who is in her late 30s, early 40s, and she said to me, we were having a conversation, but how are you, da-da-da, and she said, actually, I've been quite unwell. I was feeling fatigued. I was forgetting things. You know, I really thought, at 40, I couldn't be that old already. There were symptoms that she associated. Tiredness, lack of energy, getting things. She associated that with aging. She put up with this for around 6 months before going to a doctor to discover she had a medical issue. She overlooked it while it deteriorated because she associated it with aging. That tells us just how much we internalize some of the imagery that goes with it. Stereotypes, with aging tend to be, I suppose, associated with things like frail. I mean, Una talked about earlier on some of the language that's used in the media. But often it is associated with people being frail, people being a drain on society. It's a problem for us rather than a benefit. Yet, nonetheless, we all know older people who are volunteers, who mind grandchildren, who are out working, who contribute to the community through after-school projects, through youth work, who offer to do cancer support runs, all of those things. They're more the norm for us as well as the other aspects of aging. We really are saying we would like to change the narrative around aging and how that happens. We as an organisation firmly believe that there is already a tool that exists that could really help us combat ageism. That tool is called the National Positive Ageing Strategy. That came to the fore in 2008. It has never been resourced or never been implemented, never mind fully implemented. Referencing that strategy, the then minister said, and I need to read this to quote, at its core, the National Positive Ageing Strategy seeks to create a shift in mindset in how we collectively and individually conceptualize aging and what needs to be done to promote positive aging. was 2008. We're now in 2021 and nothing has happened. That reason that positive strategy gained momentum and support was because it was based on the views, after consultation with older people and their organisation. It was people-centred rather than service-centred. So we are clearly saying today in this webinar, calling on government to develop and support and implement in its full national positive ageing strategy. To give it in all of government approach, we believe that this will go a long way to transforming ageing in Ireland, could set us up as leaders as to how we age. I hope you can hear what we're saying and in somewhat share that and share these thoughts with other people and also with your TDs. I thank you for your time. I look forward to chatting to you later with your questions.
Thank you so much, Sue, for that really lovely and insightful piece. I'm going to bring in Paddy now. So Paddy, if you'd like to come in and share your screen, and I'll spotlight you.
Thanks, Una, and thanks to the Parliament for the invite. I really appreciate it. So just check, is this scrolling first? Can you see that? You see that? Yeah?
We can see that.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you there.
Thank you.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you there. So thanks again very much for the invite. I really appreciate it. So I'm just going to broaden out our understanding of ageism first before focusing in on the language, or just what Age Action understands as ageism. I mean, Age Action's primary objective is a society that enables all older people to participate and to live full, independent lives. It would seem like not an unreasonable expectation, and strange that you would have to have that as an objective in a modern society. But we believe that one of the key reasons that we don't have, that older people don't experience full participation, many older people tell us that they feel that they disappear and they're invisible as they get older, and they don't live full and independent life means having choice and control over your life. We believe one of the reasons for that is because of ageism. So what is ageism? According to the UN, they describe ageism as happening at a number of different levels. You know, how we think, how we feel, and both of those things lead then to how we act. They've also, and I suppose the first thing to consider there is that it is a progressive, ageism is a progressive issue, in that it is, and as Sue has touched on, it is thoughts about age and perception of age and different ages that then lead to the emergence of feelings and our own internalized prejudice and feelings. And then those feelings and prejudice lead then to acts, to us to acting out in different ways. And you can see that both at the level of the individual, but also at the level of institutions, where you end up with ageist policies coming out of organizations and institutions because they have internalized ageism and internalized the language and the belief systems in regard to ageism. I suppose the second thing to note is that internalization of ageism, that we ourselves can begin to internalize these messages. And the UN have talked about how there's quite a lot of science now that older people are hearing messages and are internalizing them, and they're leading to poorer health outcomes. So when people internalize the language of frail, the science is showing that people are less active, they're getting more psychosomatic illnesses, etc. So we are seeing the internalization of those images and words and perceptions, which is leading to ill health. But we also know that and the UN again has shown this in various studies, that we can actually address ageism quite effectively through good policy and laws which can address discrimination and equality and protect people's human rights, through educational activities and awareness raising, and through intergenerational interventions where different generations in society get to mix and experience each other and change attitudes and learn new ways of thinking about different age groups. Beyond the psychological impact, I suppose, of ageism is the actual discriminatory outcomes. So, for example, in Ireland, we, and not just Ireland, but globally, we see employment discrimination where it's harder for older people to find work, where people have insufficient income as they get older and to live a decent quality of life, where we have health services that are not available, or which happened at the beginning of the pandemic, where certain health interventions might be withheld purely based on age. Where the physical environment is not suitable for people in terms of steps and curbs and various other physical environment issues that impact on us all as we age. Digital exclusion. We did a quick piece of work looking at the number of government consultations, and out of about 11 of the last government consultations, only 1 or 2 were done on a paper basis where you could actually write in. All the rest were online. So that's a discriminatory outcome for older people, where you have to be digitally literate to even be consulted by government on a number of their policies right across government. And then again, in nursing homes and other institutions, that loss of autonomy and personal choice and control about how you live your life. So I think the other feature of ageism that we need to understand is the cumulative impact of discrimination, disadvantage for us, for people as younger people. So if a child grows up in poverty and a child grows up not accessing full education, that advantage carries with them throughout their lifetime. And you'll find that people who are disadvantaged at an earlier age and at different stages of their life, that accumulates over time, and it becomes then a very difficult feature to address at older age. And those same people then will experience poverty and disadvantage at an older age. There are methods within Irish society and the public sector equality and human rights duty, which came in under the Human Rights Act in 2014, is a specific obligation on all government departments and government funded agencies to address discrimination, inequality and human rights of their employees, customers, service users. So there are laws there that enable us to take on ageism and discriminatory outcomes for older people through exercising or through forcing the government to exercise its own legislation. And that's one example of how we can address ageism. So to end ageism, then we know what is required. We know what the opportunities are. We know we can use policy and law, education activities, intergenerational interventions. We can change knowledge, change attitudes, change behaviour. And we have examples of policies like, for example, I just mentioned the public sector duty, the Assisted Decision Making Act, which again hasn't been fully implemented. It's been promised now for about 14 years. It took a long time to get it onto the statute books, but it hasn't been fully implemented. And of course, then the Equality Acts. But I think to bring us back to the purpose of this conversation, I think refuting stereotypes is a key challenge for us all, and the use of language and imagery. And the counterpart to tackling how people use language and imagery is also that older people are the best voices to represent older people. And it's empowering and building the participation and involvement and inclusion of older people in activities to promote the rights of older people. So we'll all have seen these images, and they became particularly pronounced during the pandemic. Even the most, banal article that referenced older people carried a picture of somebody in a wheelchair or somebody's frail hands or a walking stick. I mean, they were almost, it was like that the media and the photo editors had no other bank of photographs to draw on other than these stock images. and it became really pervasive throughout the pandemic. And in many ways has set us back. And then language and concepts like the elderly that Una referred to earlier, vulnerable, dependency, frail, seeing people in masks and in gowns and etc. And we know we were in a very special moment during the pandemic, but there's a lot more that the media and government could have done. The term cocooning, for example, I spoke to the minister very early on, Minister Harris at the time, very early on in the pandemic, and said that the use of the term cocooning was problematic. It shouldn't have been come up. It shouldn't have been devised. It was, I assume some spin doctors in Fine Gael who came up with it. But it took them about 8 or 9 weeks to recognise that was actually, there was a lot of reaction to it. And I think it was about 8 or 9 weeks later that at the time the Taoiseach Varadkar acknowledged that it wasn't the most helpful use of terms, but it was quite. You can understand the public sector response is very mixed, but that the Dáil didn't step in more and represent the broader needs of people in context of what was a very serious health challenge. And these were age-based policies, remember. We know they were there to protect us all, but they were purely age-based policies. And these are people's own reactions to their experience of the pandemic. And I know Sue and a few of the other organisations were involved in the launch of a very important report today, which spoke more about the actual lived experience and the voice of older people during the pandemic. So, and there are other options, of course, for the media. There are positive images. There are other ways of depicting older people. So they don't have to rely on the standard 3 or 4 photographs that they seem to only have access to. And there are other ways. There's Positive Aging Week coming up in October. There's the United Nations Decade of Healthy Aging. So we have the tools to tackle. Ageist narratives, and we have the tools to tackle ageist images. Again, the key point, I think, from Age Action's point of view, is that the best people to represent older people and to tackle ageism is older people themselves. So I think the other key theme for all of us as organisations working in this sector is how do you build the voice of older people themselves to represent themselves, and that not talking for, but allowing people to represent themselves. And I think there is a challenge, and and I would have talked about this with the Alliance members. I think there is a challenge for us as NGOs working in the sector that we're not part of the narrative of othering older people, that we don't use terms like vulnerable, alone. There's almost a pervasive acceptance now that older people are lonely. A lot of organizations are describing loneliness as a problem. Yes, there is loneliness in our lives. We all experience loneliness at different times of our lives, but older people per se are not lonely. And so I think even as NGOs, we have to challenge ourselves and ask, are we at times adding to the challenge of taking on ageist language and ageist attitudes? That's all from me, Una. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Paddy. That was really interesting, particularly the focus on the imagery. I think that's something we all definitely noticed over the last 1.5 years now, the pervasive use of certain imagery. So Damien, if you'd like to come in, I'm going to spotlight you, and feel free to share your...
Get this up and run. So again, like Paddy, I'm really happy and delighted to be here, and didn't hesitate to say yes when Sue asked me, and thought afterwards, what am I going to talk about? Sue was challenging me to think about Treoir on our service and the issues that people who use our service experience, particularly people who are older, and it really challenged me in many ways, because Treoir is an organization that's been around for a long time. So I'm going to say a little bit about who Treoir is, because I'm sure that not everybody knows who we are and what we do. And then what are some of the issues? I'm taking a slightly different tack from others, in that what I'm hoping is to show that the issues as they impact on the service users of our organization, and how those stereotypes and often, assumptions made about older people lead to disadvantage in services and lead to huge issues that people face later in later life. So start off by just saying a little bit about Treoir. It's been around since the 70s, and we support parents. It was founded back in its day really around mothers who had children outside of marriage. And you can imagine back in the 70s, even though it's not that long ago, that at a very different time in Ireland, that women were to mother and baby homes, and and we're now living with the consequences of all those issues that have come from that. And Treoir was founded to try and look at, the service that we're working with unmarried parents. How would they, how could they support it and get rid of some of the language and the terms? And we talked a lot about language today, the terms around illegitimacy, and we still have struggled with this whole thing of why do we separate the married from the unmarried? And we use unmarried because of the fact that the Constitution supports the family based on marriage. And if you have children and create a family outside of that, despite the fact that we've had a huge amount of progress, and we now have the family and the marriage has extended rightfully to include anybody who can get married, same-sex couples. So, but still the unmarried family within that faces huge issues. And so we provide a national information service. We can coordinate a teen parent support program. And I think the one today that kind of focus on a little bit would be the kinship care support and the shared parenting. And shared parenting is by parents who don't live together with their children, but want to have and raise that child well. For me, Treoir, and I was really challenged when Sue was talking to me, Treoir practices, principles of community development. And we talk about anti-racism, anti-sexism, inclusion, the human rights focus, engagement of people affected by the issue. So nothing about us without us. So, but in looking back and thinking about it today, we don't talk about ageism in that, and we don't look at how we challenge ageism. So as much as I'm talking about the issues we are supporting parents around, I was also really challenged to look at how our organization is actively, tackling ageism and participating in the proper place to do that, and not just blaming all of the woes on state bodies who do have a lot of responsibility in this area. So a national information service is primarily run by a phone service. So there's an online service, there's website, there's information publications, there's animated videos, there's a whole way of we pass that information on, but primarily it's about people picking up the phone and contacting an information officer. And the people who call that service is for parents, grandparents, family members, friends, professionals, people working with families where the parents are not married to each other. And we believe that every child has a right to an identity and to know and have a relationship with both parents and those parents' extended family. And so what we get an awful lot of calls from is around the issues of guardianship, access, custody, maintenance. And they're always the top issues every year that we come in, and they come from all sorts. It's kind of the issues that come from the older cohort. And again, even in thinking about this, one of the big presumptions and misconceptions is that you don't have older parents that have younger children. You do. You still have a lot of older parents that have children and that are under 18 and just that they have custody and guardianship of. But one of the ways that we identify and I have to think about this is around grandparents who call the service. And so from this year, for the first 6 months this year, we've had 117 queries from grandparents. The main issues that grandparents face that they contact us is around access for their children to see their grandchildren. Now, this can happen if you think about two parents who are living separately and they don't get on. If one of those parents that has the primary care of the children doesn't get on with the father, and the father has to, the father say in this case, the father has to apply for access, often that father might get a short-lived access, but the grandparents, his parents, don't get to see that child, or else they have to apply directly. And sometimes it's the grandparents pushing for the father or the mother to get the access so they can see the child. But now, since the legislation changed, since the Children and Family Relationships Act, grandparents can apply in their own right, only since the last 5 years, that they can apply in their own right to have time with their grandchildren, which is a huge issue. And other queries relate to guardianship, around testamentary guardianship. That's if a parent dies, grandparents often take on the care of the children. I'm going to talk a bit more about that. Temporary guardianship, if something happens to one of the parents, and queries about kinship care arrangements. So I'll speak a little bit more about that. But I wanted to just highlight that we did do, and it surprised us, and again, trying to think about why did this surprise us, because we weren't getting a lot of, as you saw, only 117 queries to date out of something so far nearly 5,000 queries, only 117 were from grandparents. But we ran an information campaign around guardianship because it's an issue that's very often misunderstood. And so we decided to run a campaign across the whole headings of guardianship. And it just went out on our social media platform, Facebook and our YouTube sites. The most popular advert that went out that was looked at, the greatest interactions, was one that was aimed at grandparents. And that surprised us. We thought it was going to be single fathers. We thought it was going to be, that issue, but it was grandparents that had the biggest number and the best interaction. And the ad simply, there was a static ad that just popped up on your screen. If you happen to have, the last slide showed some of the things that people would be interested in. If you happen to be on one of those website or Facebook pages, this ad might pop up. And it basically said, guardianship gives you the legal right and responsibility to make major decisions on upbringing and well-being of the child in your care. So what we are discovering, and we knew that a lot of grandparents do take care of their grandchildren, and for all sorts of reasons, and that they do it out of love and compassion, and often in a case where their parents, the biological birth parents, aren't able to care for their child, and the grandparents will take that role on, and so the interactions that we got were from a lot of parents, grandparents really communicate with each other on the chat around, they didn't know this, they were really, this was their situation, and it really generated a lot of interest and made us think about that cohort that we really need to be doing a lot more at supporting the groups. You'll see that of the impressions on the ad on the left, the static ad was 66,530 and 204 post reactions, the best of all of them, and it only ran for a month. So it's something that we're going to continue to do over time. Why am I talking about that? Because I think there's almost an ingrained stereotype and that affects the way that services are provided. And one of the big ones, and we've just started to support our kinship care Ireland. We've just received some funding from TUSA to run out a program of support for kinship care. Kinship care arises when children can no longer be cared for by their biological parents. And it can be for lots of reasons, such as death, illness, imprisonment, abandonment, substance abuse. And in Ireland, it's often the grandparents who step in to take over that role. It can be an older relative, it can be an uncle or aunt, and they step in to take on that role. And TUSLA, as a state agency, are often hugely involved in the early stages of this. They everybody wants to see that, that for a child to be in a loving family relationship with the extended family rather than in state support. But what we're seeing is that as TUSLA often will negotiate these informal care arrangements, that they step back. It's no longer a child protection issue, so the grandparent is taking on the care of their children. And opportunities to become foster parents are limited for grandparents. Now, they're limited for a lot of people who are in that situation, but younger parents have a much better opportunity to become foster parents than older parents do. And one of the reasons is I believe that there's a huge assumption made that grandparents would do it because they care and are compassionate and they love their grandchildren. But that goes without saying. And then there's this whole area where they still need a huge amount of support. And there's a big gap in that support. So for us, what has happened in a lot of the cases, the older parents have reported having to give up employment while facing significant increase in household outgoings as a direct result of trying to meet the care of their grandchildren. And this quote really strikes it for me, and this is one of many that we could have put up here, that this grandmother took on the care of her two grandchildren who were highly traumatized, so had a need for a huge amount of support, and when she took them in. And all of her energy and more went into support them. And she went from having a manager's salary to a pension, and she had to extend her mortgage payments into her 70s. And extra costs such as home maintenance, medical bills, car maintenance became impossible, and her home deteriorated, as did her health. Now there's a huge amount of other things that go on. She could have been entitled to what they call the guardianship payment, But if your children are in the care of the state, there's a whole range of supports that go into that, both for the carer and for the child in care, and they are not there in any way for the informal care arrangements. And yet, this is parents who do this because of the love and compassion for their children, but there's a huge cost associated with it. And what Kinship Care Ireland is trying to work with TUSLA and the state around is trying to find a better framework that supports the families and the children that are in care. And because it's a lot of older parents, the assumption is that older parents want to do it, they have the free time, they're not doing anything else, and they're available to look after their kids. And it prevents them from living and having a full life at a time when they really maybe are looking forward to that, having a bit more space and time to do other engagements. So, and that's really it, that our experience suggests that grandparents may experience ambivalence about taking on kinship care roles and responsibilities. They can find themselves faced with a set of expectations which appear to be grounded on assumption that they have a moral obligation and are available to do this on a voluntary basis. And it has created this very grey space which provides a cheap way out for the state. And when I was thinking about the presentation today, I was trying to think of examples there where I feel that ageism is embedded within the systems, and that these are the type of things that we have to challenge on an ongoing basis. But what I was really as equally struck on is our own organizations need to look at what are we doing around ageism? How are we, meeting that needs of that cohort? And the fact that we were very surprised by our ad campaign that grandparents were the biggest number, but gave us a wake-up call that we probably need to be more aware, more active, and more engaged. So for me, I'm so happy and welcome to be here to hear the conversation today. And for anybody who wants to, those who might be affected by any of the issues, I've left the phone numbers up there for Kinship Care and Treoir. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Damien. And again, I think that gives an insight into the various different roles people can have and maintain. And again, moving away from that sort of pigeonholing of people as they age into certain boxes. So I guess we're moving to now a more discussion sort of element. So again, to all of the attendees that are here, if you'd like to put up your hand and take part, feel free. We'd be delighted to have you in. I just think I want to pick up on something, Paddy, you were talking about when it came to how, loneliness and being alone has become a kind of the pervasive narrative when it comes to talking about older people in society. And I know that we as NGOs have to advocate particularly against difficult things in society and the difficulties facing people we represent. How do we balance that advocacy against it becoming a negative and dominant narrative, do you think?
Well, I think there's a responsibility first on us as agents to ask why we're making the statement. So I think I'm referring to agencies who put out the message because they feel a pressure to raise funds or to sustain the organization, and so we find ourselves adding to the narrative or adding to that discourse because there's a pressure to raise funds and to do fundraising and to advertise and all that kind of thing, rather than actually stopping and saying, well, what are our values as an organization? What do we understand about ageism? What do we mean when we use the words we use? And reflecting first on the types of language and whether we're contributing to a society that isn't ageist, or whether we're contributing to a society that actually others people, and creates this. So I think it is a real challenge, and like I appreciate the pressure that people are under, but I think it is about the words we use, why we use them, having some self-reflection on why we use the types of words we use, and taking personal responsibility first and foremost.
Thank you. I don't know if Sue or Damien, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I was struck quite forcibly by what Paddy said. And I think one of the places that when I hear him in that response, where our energy may need to go in is to challenging how funding structures enable or support a narrative that needs to be challenged rather than supported. I think funding for all organisations is a crucial issue if we are to genuinely tackle what are some of the issues. And having to any campaign, and it's been across the ages, I think, and other campaigns I've been involved in, is having to use the story, the narrative of, in this instance, of loneliness and isolation, or in terms of some of the issues around the women's movement and marriage equality, and highlighting the worst aspects should not be criteria by which we access funding. I think we need to look at that collectively, maybe.
Only thing I'd add to that, Una, would be in relation to, I think I'm really getting struck by the whole idea of this, the separation or the segmentation of the kind of different issues that we face. So like the anti-racism, discrimination issues. And one of the ways that we've talked about trying to address them so that there's a broader sense of that, while you do have to look at individual issues like ageism, sexism, racism, you do have to look at them. There's a collective piece that overarches all that, is around a quality proofing, a really robust quality proofing policies and in place. Now, you'll hear when you go to any government meetings, they say, oh, we do equality proof them, or we do poverty proof these issues. Well, if they do, they must be doing it really badly, and it's not working in an effective way. So it's a robust way, and it can't be something that's beyond the skill levels of the people within the departments, and they can reach out to others to do it. So I just think the quality proofing piece that's missing, or needs to be much more effective in how we do that. So when we're looking at policies, we're actually ensuring that you're not othering, and you're actually ensuring that you're catching a lot more, and don't have to wait for the individual one to raise their hand and say, you've missed me, you've missed us, you've missed this group over here.
The other feature for me, Damien, is that as NGOs, working outside of silos, and developing more alliances across different, sectors, and I know Sue has mentioned that the Parliament are trying to do this more, and certainly Age Action will be doing it more over the coming months in terms of trying to work with travellers groups or with LGBT groups. But also, I think what's really important and hasn't been really driven home by voluntary organisations and the NGO sector in Ireland is the language of equality and human rights. We haven't really developed, and I think as people, whether it's older people or other communities of interest, understand their own rights and what equality and discrimination means, and start to use that language more, I think that will create a demand for change. That if older people understand that what they're experiencing is ageism, or what they're experiencing is a discriminatory outcome, and that we start to use that language more, that will start to begin a more of a movement towards equality for all. And I think that's a piece that Age Action certainly is focused on for the next few years.
And I think one of the things in relation to that reaching out, and as Damien said, not looking at equality proofing. If I look across the spectrum, and I think of older people, not a group that sits somewhere. They're included LGBTI community, traveller community, migrant community. There is no such thing as young people who hit those, or middle-aged people. It's people and equality, and that's what we need to look at, rather than, so it is that joined up thinking across the life cycle and the equality proofing. To me, they're really crucial, and looking to reach across and connect some of that would be really important.
We have a question in here. It's on the cocooning, and somebody is wondering about the cocooning in the first months of the pandemic. How did it sit within legislation, and would it have contravened legislation? But I suppose also maybe to talk on it as an aspect of language, because I know from the Telling It Like It Is document that came out yesterday that cocooning was highlighted as a term, as being something that a lot of older people had issues with in general. Perhaps, Sue, do you want to start off there? We'll start with yourself.
Yeah, I think the very word cocooning in and of itself says a huge amount about the approach at the outset of the pandemic, and how, I struggle sometimes with the notion that cocooning was about protection. Yes, it was, but what were we protecting? Was it an overwhelming our hospital services? I think one of the difficulties was in the rush to respond to the reality of how that impacted on older people, the notion of whether it was actually even legally appropriate or correct bypassed. And I think that's an issue now coming to the fore and they need to be challenged. And Paddy may know a little bit more about that. But I do think that it highlighted in a way ageism. It really focused the attention on older people in a way that was very.
I think
It fully stands up.
I come in there, Sue. Yeah, you finished, Sue?
Please, Paddy.
Yeah, I think it was a real grey area. So many people thought that they had to cocoon, but actually it was advice. But the advice was so persuasive and pervasive, I suppose, that many people interpreted it as a law, that it was a requirement to cocoon. And there was all kinds of pressures. And many people have talked about feeling pressure to, be noticed when they were out or be commented on that they were out if they were an older person, etc. Family members telling them to be safe, etc. And many older people have said to us, we did it for our own protection, and the government was trying to protect us, and they understood why. But there's a real grey area there, and the Irish Council for Civil Liberties have produced a report just recently on the human rights impacts of various pieces of advice and legislation that were brought in. But cocooning was never a law; it was never a legal requirement. It was advice, but many people interpreted it as a legal issue, as something that they had to do, they were required to do. So technically, it didn't break any laws because it was advice. But how it was presented and how it was languaged and how it was carried by the media, etc. Many people interpreted it as they were required to cocoon, that it was an offence not to cocoon.
Absolutely. And again, that all goes back into how we have the language in the media. Perhaps, Damien, the aspect of cocooning as well would have impacted on people you would come across from grandparents in particular. How was that? I suppose, how was the advice? How was it interpreted? And what were the impacts on families?
Huge. It was the first months of the COVID lockdown in March, April of 2020. We opened our service for longer hours, weekends, bank holidays, because the volume of calls was huge. And the main issue was how people perceive, well, at that time there was lockdown, we were not allowed to go outside the 5K rule, your 5K, which in itself caused massive problems. So you can imagine children who normally spend time with both parents in different homes, and suddenly if that home is 5K outside of the area, or if one of the parents lives with their grandparents, there was huge issues, and particularly in not always where there's conflict, but particularly where there was conflict, it was seen to be used in a way that it said, well, I can't, my parents are vulnerable, you can't have a child coming in because I don't know when he's with you or she's with you if they're behaving themselves and you're abiding by the protocols. And so there was huge issues, and we had to work, we worked closely with the minister, the justice minister at the time, to try and get some clarity. It was they didn't know what, they were on the hoof all the time themselves trying to work this out. But like Paddy said, some of the language and some of the ways in which things were I suppose, picked up by the media and ran with caused huge difficulties. And you had people with absolutes in their minds that took a long time to shift in relation to how they could feel. A child that lives in both homes is still in two homes, and creating a place where the safety of the grandparents. So people were taking that advice if their parents were anyway over 60, 70. My parents, they're not even a health risk, they're just over 70. And they can't be meeting anybody, and so. Children were ultimately been denied access to see their parents and their grandparents through the first stages of COVID and still are, to be honest, until we could really get, some clarity from the court, from the Department of Justice and from the Health Service about how to do this.
Now, I also think one of the things that we need to be conscious of, that while it was not, as Paddy says, legislation, it was not law. When you see a guard at the checkpoint stopping you and asking you where you're going, it's hard to interpret that as anything different but the law. I know at the time our CEO then continually found reasons to say she had to shop elsewhere. And yet we knew it was not the law. At the end of the day, are the checkpoints reinforce a message very, very strongly.
Absolutely. We have a very interesting question in here from Tom. Let me just get it up there. It's asking about highlighting the fact that a lot of people, older people in the LGBT plus community who've grown up in the 50s, 60s and 70s, they're fearing getting older as they are more likely maybe not to have family supports, and they fear that if they have to go into a care home, they may also go back in the closet, which obviously would be of huge concern. So Tom's asking, should medical service be made aware that being older doesn't stop somebody from being a sexual being? And I think this actually ties not just to people from the LGBT plus community, but for heterosexual older people as well. There's a kind of a diminishment of their sexual agency. So is that something we should be advocating for in care homes and medical services? I don't know who'd like to take that first.
Two pieces of that strike me. Some 20 years ago, when I started out in community development, I worked on a campaign around creating greater awareness around LGBT rights and issues. And that concern was alive then. I can remember older people talking to us about what happens, Sue, when I get to the point. I'm not going into an nursing home element of it. Nothing has changed hugely, nor have we advocated to see a change. And I think that's something we as NGOs need to take on board and work in a more collective way to address. The second piece for me really strikes me is that when we talk about language around aging, there is an assumption, like if you think of small children and they mention parents having sex, when you mention grandparents having a sexual need or identity, that absolutely creates horror in adult children, let alone the systems. And we forget that people who make our policies have lived in a society that have heard all of that throughout their lives. So yes, there is an assumption. You have no need. Those needs die at a certain point. And I think it is important that we begin to address that. I think also there's a legacy of our country having some level of repressed sexual need or addressing. As Damien said, if you think of the word illegitimacy, how women were treated outside, having children outside of the marriage. I mean, I'm of that vintage, so I can certainly remember the horror of that time. So I do think definitely how we began to look at women and their sexual needs, we now need to address. We're not fully there yet, but I think we now need to look. I'm laughing at one of Dottie's columns. You know, Ireland repressed about sexuality, really? Absolutely, we are. But I just think that it is an issue. But it's also, you have to be conscious of people who've grown up in that environment are not necessarily comfortable. We've got to find a way.
We had a European funded program, LGBT plus program with a number of groups in Ireland and EU funded, and I think you're right. It is a key issue about the rights of all of us as we age in terms of our own identity, how we express ourselves, what we call ourselves. And you know, I think Sue was touching on I think the problem with institutional care in any shape or form, if it is the choice of people, and it's not often a choice, if it's the only option for people to take up institutional care, i.e. a nursing home, well then you're stepping into an environment where your control of your own life is very significantly diminished. Your right to choice and your right to control, your right to loving relationships, your right to intimate sexual relationships, your right to decide what you eat. I mean, all these things become institutionalized and more about the institution. And I think So when we talk about medical services, should they be informed about LGBT plus choices? I think it's really about choices for all of us as we age. And I would say many older people, couples who are going into nursing homes, whether they're LGBT plus or not, don't have choice and options and controls about how they want to be in their own relationship. So it is a much broader issue in terms of institutional care, not being able to age at home and live your life out in the way you want to, close to your own community. So I think it is linked to that idea that we become dependent on the state and nursing homes, etc. And that really needs to be addressed, as a matter of priority. That people have a right to not end up dependent on institutional care.
I don't know, Damien, if you want to come in there.
Only, I mean, I totally agree, and I'd say yes, absolutely. Medical services need to be made aware that people, don't stop being sexually active and desire to have a sex life when they're older and in care homes. I would say just we get a small amount of funding from the HSE through the Sexual Health and Crisis Pregnancy Unit, and they are currently doing their next strategic plan, and we had a major discussion around this whole area of sexual health and well-being amongst older people, and it was great to see it, and the debate was really good, and there was some really good agencies there speaking up on that issue. So I think it'd be imperative that we and anybody who can tries to influence that. And Paddy's right. I think a lot of the care homes and institutions, are really going to have to take that on as a bit of a priority, because it's so I have a personal experience of it. It can be very demeaning for people, and I would say there needs to be particular attention to the particular groups who have experienced discrimination in our society, so like the LGBT community, because they will find that even though you might move some ways with heterosexual couples, you mightn't be as quick to move with other groups. So absolutely, I think it's an important one.
One of the things too, I think, is in terms of when people, it's as much about our sexual need and desire, but it's also about the need for intimacy and support. And I know that here, somebody I know very well, they had an accident in France some years back, and they were automatically, because they were husband and wife, put into the same room together because they would need the intimate support of each other, in that sense of being able to touch, being able to talk. And that's something even our medical model has not addressed. When they were shipped home to Ireland, they were put into two separate rooms, and we had to battle for that to be addressed. I'm going back, 15 years, and I don't think much has changed in reality about that. And it's as much a need for that support and loving care that people reference as much as it is about their sexual identity and need.
I'm aware that we've hit the hour, and I think we could keep going for a long time. There's a lot more questions to be had, but I'm afraid we're going to finish up. And I think that was a really interesting discussion, and a lot of interesting factors came out that perhaps I don't think I quite foresaw coming through, and that's really brilliant. Thank you so much, Sue, Paddy, and Damien. That was brilliant. We really appreciate your time. And to all of the attendees who joined us as well for the webinar. The webinar is, of course, recorded, and we'll be putting it up on our social media channels and website. But if you have any questions, feel free to get in contact with me. My email is policyandcommunications@seniors.ie, and you'll find that on our website as well. And again, thank you to everybody, and hope to see you all again going forward. Thank you.